Hey everybody, this is Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com. For all of the parts and accessories in the whole wide world for your Vespa, check us out on the web, ScooterWest.com. In order to find all the quality spare parts in order to do a successful repair, such as the stator replacement, check us out on web, ScooterWest.com, free shipping, over $100 orders. So let's get right into it. I'm going to show today how to remove the stator and flywheel. These two parts generate the power to power all the electrical system on the scooter. Operates very similar to what you would refer to as an alternator on a car. It actually is alternating current, three-phase alternating current, generates power, but it has some added components that are part of the ignition system. This is the pickup coil that triggers the ignition system to fire the spark plug. So maybe you have a problem with the ignition system, you have a problem with the charging system, you would need to do this job in order to replace this part. Maybe you have a flywheel with a broken magnet or is damaged, or you want to put the higher output flywheel. That would be a reason you want to go this far into this job. Two other items that you may service while having the stator out is the right side main seal. So this is an oil seal that keeps the engine oil on the inside of the motor and the air and the environment on the outside of the motor. Another common part that you may need to replace is the oil pressure switch. This switch is triggered when there's low oil pressure to indicate that you have dangerously low oil pressure while operating the scooter. Sometimes the switch fails by not functioning, such as the oil light doesn't come on when you turn the scooter on, or sometimes it gets stuck on. But most commonly it will start leaking oil, and that may be a reason why you need to replace that switch. We have all these parts always available and in stock at ScooterWest.com. Look in the description of this video so you can see the part numbers for these common jobs. And before I get started, I'll tell you about what motors this is specific to. It's pretty much 2001 all the way up to around 2014, minus all the GTS 250s and 300s and Primaveras and Sprints. Pretty much almost applies to the 50 cc's as well. This is a 150 cc fly motor, very similar to the LX or ET4 motor. So a very important tool that you will need, that's a specialty tool you're not going to find at a regular hardware store, is the flywheel puller. And it's Tool Fly on our website, ScooterWest.com. Same flywheel puller as the one that's used for the vintage Vespa PX. Next, you're going to need this one-time use locking nut for the center of the flywheel, part number 436783. So let's move on to just the more standard workshop tools. And I would say this is like an intermediate level of job and set of workshop tools that you need to do this job. 3/8 ratchet. I specifically am going to use an 18mm and a 17mm socket, preferably deep. I got an Allen wrenches here, 5mm. I'm a 4mm and a 6mm. An adjustable wrench to hold the flywheel puller, needle nose, a diagonal cutter, a Phillips screwdriver. This is a rather specific tool called a pin spanner, and it's used to hold the flywheel. Comes in very handy on other tasks on modern Vespas. Alternatively, you can lock up the flywheel with a strap or a chain wrench, which is more commonly available than this pin spanner. Or you can just cheat and use it air impact and zap the nut right off. Highly recommend having a torque wrench. Goes up to minimum 60 foot-pounds to retorque the new center nut on the flywheel. You're going to need blue thread locker, either made by Loctite or many other companies make it. It's just typically referred to as medium strength blue thread lock. So let's jump right into it. Let's dismantle this flywheel and stator, and then we'll put it all back together. And keep in mind, I have a motor that's out of the scooter. There's not much that you need to dismantle on a scooter that's all together. You may take off those side plastic skirts that kind of, they'll give you a little bit more access right here. You're going to need to remove the single connector for this stator to disconnect it. Definitely don't need to remove the motor or drop the motor to do this job. If you have the Vespa GT200 that's liquid cooled, you definitely have a lot more ahead of you, as you need to probably drain your coolant and essentially remove the right-hand side cover, which is also the water pump. So if your engine has the air injection system, which is this extra little hose here and a metal pipe coming off this fan cover, you're going to need to take this outer plastic cover off. There's several Phillips screws. You remove, get this cover out of the way. And you have one more screw you got to loosen up on this air injection pump. It's the outer, larger M6 screw, and then you're able to separate this filter assembly. Keep in mind there is a filter in here, maybe something you want to clean because the air injection system actually does breathe air that injects into the exhaust system. This foam here, I'd recommend leaving it alone. It does quiet up the intake. It quiets up the fan noise. So again, if your model has the air injection tube, you can either use a 10mm socket or a 6mm Allen key and remove the pair nuts with the split washers or the locking washers that hold this metal air injection tube to the cylinder head. And it will just pull right away. It does have a rubber joint. And there's going to be a copper gasket that's going to drop out as well. So at this point, we can just kind of leave it in place because when we pull this whole cover off, we'll dismantle that hose. You have a pair of Phillips screws here. They're 5mm screws that go into clips on the cylinder shrouds. And it is possible to remove the fan cover without removing the muffler. It is a little bit easier if the muffler is out. I'm using a 4mm Allen key to take the screws out. The older models just use Phillips screws. And the last screw, go ahead and pull that out of the way. It is a little tight with the muffler. There's also a washer with it. And at this point, we'll be able to separate the cover and pull this air tube away from the cylinder head. So the first step is to remove this air injection tube from the cylinder head. And it takes a little bit of Mickey Mousing to get it to pull off the pair of studs that are in your cylinder head. And now it's separated. There is a gasket that's still left behind up there. I'm just going to leave it alone. It's a copper high temperature gasket. And at that point, you can pull this away. You're going to have one remaining hose that goes to this diaphragm valve on this air injection pump. If you're wondering what that pump is, it's all for emissions. Helps the exhaust run cleaner by injecting air to help burn unburnt fuel that goes into the exhaust system. Just recommend leaving it alone. There's no problems with it. Does its job. And at this point, we see the cooling fan, and underneath that cooling fan is the flywheel. The connector to the stator is now loose because that's trapped by that plastic fan cover. Go ahead and remove the fan. Typically, these screws have Loctite on them. Check out the fan, make sure none of the blades are broken. I've seen several LXs, ET4s over the years that have broken blades. Obviously, that causes a cooling problem. Keep your screws all organized. And these screws have a split washer and a flat washer. This cover is actually keyed so it only goes one direction. So that's not a perfect triangle, so it only lines up one direction. You could, just to make it a little easier, you can take a pen, like a Sharpie, kind of look at where the holes are, make a mark here, make a mark on a flywheel just to help you out, and pull the fan away. So next we're going to want to remove this flywheel. And you can see there's a center nut that holds it. You're going to need an 18mm socket to do so. One thing is this flywheel turns. A couple ways to lock it up. You could put a strap wrench around the outside of the flywheel. That's a commonly available part. Here in the workshop, I have a pin spanner, as they call it, and that can go between some of the holes on this on the flywheel. Alternatively, if you have an air or electric impact, you can just zap that nut right off. And with the muffler in the way, there's something to lock it up against. You know, if you're using something like this. Obviously, I'm kind of showing you the best case with the specialized tool. And one thing about this nut, shouldn't really reuse it. In a pinch, you could put Loctite on it and reuse it. This dome washer is just intended for one-time use. It's like a locking washer. And obviously if flywheel doesn't come off, you need the flywheel puller. So you'll need the specific flywheel puller for this flywheel. Ironically, it's the same as the P series one, and our part number at scooterwest.com is Tool Fly. It may look a little different than this flywheel puller, but typically they have a flat on it, and you use a socket on this and a wrench to hold this in place while you tighten this center bolt down. So I went ahead and put an adjustable wrench on the flats of the flywheel puller, and I got a 17mm socket. Sometimes the flywheel pullers use a 19mm socket. Just a little bit of a twist, it should pop the flywheel right off. At that point, you can pull the flywheel off. This wood key right here usually stays in place. I never see that they really drop out of place on this. Go ahead and pull this out. This is the older series flywheel with the ceramic magnets. The later ones have a kind of a dull metal appearance that looks solid. Those are the neodymium magnets. They actually charge at a higher rate. The GT200's always had the better quality flywheel. But if you replace this part, you could put the higher output flywheel with the neodymium magnets, which is a superseded part that we sell at scooterwest.com. But typically you're taking this all apart because you have a problem with the stator not charging. Covered how to test this stator, the resistance between the three phases, or maybe the scooter's not running or starting. It may be the pickup, which is part of the ignition system. And there's also the wiring to the low oil pressure switch, which is located right behind here. So if you see a bunch of oil around here that's not from the oil filter, you maybe have a leaky oil pressure switch. If you see oil dripping down the center, you may have a leaky left side main seal or right side main seal. And I definitely recommend taking care of those problems if you're this far into doing this job. So there's a single zip tie that holds the wire and connection to this oil pressure switch. You can cut that zip tie out of the way. Pull the terminal, it just pulls right off the switch. And we're going to go ahead and use our Phillips screwdriver and remove the screws at the pickup coil. Sometimes they're pretty tight. You may need to use an impact screwdriver. These are the short screws, the pair of screws that hold the pickup coil to the engine case. And up here is a bracket that traps the wiring and keeps it out of the flywheel. And again, it's a short screw. I'll leave it with the bracket. And at this point, there's just a pair of remaining screws that hold the stator to the engine case. And typically these have Loctite on, so they have quite a bit of friction when removing these screws. And you see, pull the second screw out. The stator's going to want to pull right away from the engine with the pickup assembly. All right, time to put the stator back in. So pretty much it's all reverse steps. Won't do much talking, but I'll start putting it all back together. So go ahead and line your stator up. The wiring goes towards the top. You have your pair of screws. You might want to clean the threads before you put them back in. Just a dot of Loctite on both screws. And typically if you end up with too much, you can just use the next screw and kind of roll it right onto the threads of the next one. And just hand tight is all you need to do. This wiring routes down this side right here. Make sure the pickup coil wiring isn't pinched. You don't need Loctite on these two screws. You could if you wanted to. There is a pin on the back of the pickup that keys with the engine case. Go ahead and make the connection for this oil pressure switch. You're going to need a little zip tie. This goes right around the whole pressure switch in the wire. Its only job there is to keep the wire out of the fan and the flywheel and secure the wiring here. So just go ahead and put that around the body of the oil pressure switch just like it was originally from the factory. Cut the zip tie. And the last part under here is going to be this shield that protects the wiring and kind of routes the wiring in the right positions here. And of course I'm putting the same stator back in. There's no problem with the stator, but if it's a new stator, you kind of got to wrestle with the new wires a little bit because they're a little bit on the stiff side with the brand new wires. So next we're going to go ahead and put the flywheel on, and you can see this slot right here lines up with this Woodruff key right here. So typically I'll just look directly down this, and be careful because you can get your fingers pinched because it does want to just pull right on. Go ahead and turn it, just make sure it's working. Nothing's binding up. Go ahead and thread the nut on. You don't need to put any Loctite on that. Set a torque wrench to about 62 foot-pounds. 18mm socket. And again, with the muffler in place, there's something to kind of hold this, lock this up. Then there's other ways to kind of hold everything, but I find this works the best if the muffler is still in the way or in place. And it's going to take quite a bit of turns to get the full 62 foot-pounds on. And there we go. So now the flywheel's back in. I did make a mark on the flywheel. It makes it a little easier for me to line up this fan. If not, you could just eyeball down it. Make sure all three of the threaded holes on the flywheel are visible on this. If it's a GT200 that's liquid cooled, it actually has pins that have rubber insulation on the outside of them that are threaded into these, and that's what engages with the water pump. Kind of a different arrangement. With these screws, I also recommend doing Loctite. I have seen these flywheels or the fans come loose from the flywheel. They got a wave washer and a flat washer. Just a small amount of Loctite is all it's needed. And just start by getting one of the screws in place. And not tighten them all the way. I'll get them all started first. And make sure you use the specific screws for this. If you put too long of a screw, it's going to damage the flywheel. And I have seen that actually. Somebody's put the wrong screw in there and they wonder why the scooter runs for a while, then the battery goes dead and it tore up the whole stator. So just go between the three fasteners here, tighten them down. Again, pretty much just as tight as you can do them by hand with the Phillips hand driver. That's all you need to do. Don't use an impact with them. And make sure the motor turns over freely, no problems there. And at this point, we're going to go ahead and put the cover back on. Make sure this cover's in good condition. The difficult part is getting this air injection tube to kind of line up. There's a pair of pegs on the top and the bottom that engage with the shrouds, the plastic shrouds over the cylinder. And next you want to get this rubber grommet that houses the connector. One thing to keep in mind, the stators on the fuel injected models are different. So if you're doing this on an LX150 IE, you can have some different components. Just hold it in place, get one of the screws in there. Start with this bottom one here, just to kind of keep it from falling off. And the copper gasket is already up in the cylinder head. You could use a little bit of silicone sealant or grease And then you just want to get this metal tube to go over the pair of studs. Just like that. So make sure that's all lined up. And this screw is a little more difficult because it's kind of behind the muffler. You gotta kind of get the washer started. I know the camera's not getting a good visual on what I'm doing here. And tighten the lower one. Then you have the pair of screws that hold the fan cover to the shrouds. Same length as the screws that hold the stator plate to the engine case, and they thread right into those metal Tinman clips that are on the shrouds there. Next, we'll go ahead and put the filters all in place. Good idea to clean these if needed. These are the foam pieces that kind of isolate some of the noise from the engine. And I would start with these longer screws that surround the center of the fan, get them all started as the foam kind of pushes. They're all the same, these longer screws here. Once you have those, take that large screw that holds the air injection pump to that plastic outer cover. Go ahead and make the hose connection. Make sure this hose is in good shape. If it's in poor shape, I suggest replacing it. It's got a little clip. Use a needle nose to get that clip. Reuse that clip. Holds the hose in place. And there's one more long screw, and that will go at this upper position right here. And we got the little cover, and it uses these short, smaller screws to hold it in place. So the last step is to put the pair of long special nuts that retain this tube on the air injection to the cylinder head. And it's got this wave washer. You kind of got to get it up onto the stud as you thread this on. And it's definitely a lot easier with the Allen key. You could put a 10mm wrench on there. Or socket, I meant. This is definitely a little bit easier. There's just not much clearance, especially when you're doing this on the scooter. So get those both tightened up, and if you want to torque them, they'd be about 7 or 8 foot-pounds. And then go ahead and make the stator connection. Definitely want to do that. Scooter's not going to start if you don't have that connection made. So thanks for watching. Hope you found that useful. Whether it's a job you're tackling right at the moment because you have a problem with your scooter charging, you got a problem with the fan, you got an oil leak, etc. For some reason you need to take that off, take the motor all the way apart, whatever. I sure hope the video helps you out. Or maybe you're just watching it just because you're curious on how to do this particular job on a modern Vespa. It's pretty similar across many of the other scooters. They generally have 2 types of stator and flywheel configurations on scooters. They're either dry, like this motor, so everything was, I didn't have any oil bath that I had to touch. Or you have scooters such as the GT200, 300, the Primavera Sprint, any of the large CC scooters, 350s, 500s. The stator and the flywheel are actually contained within the engine oil, and the reason they do that is they cool the stator plate, the coils on that stator, with the engine oil. So it's actually a better design when they're internal on the motor. But of course, when they fail, you got a bigger job because you got to partly dismantle the motor and drain the engine oil and typically coolant as well. And if you're looking to tackle this job, just to help you out, look in the description of this video, and I have a list of the specialized tools and the parts I used in this video. Thanks again for watching. Robot here from Scooter West and Vespa Motorsport. And consider subscribing I have well over 600 videos here in, I have well over 600 videos here in January 2021. Safe scooting. Thanks again.